George W. Bush became the 43rd President of the United States in January 2001. Just 8 months later, the Twin Towers in New York were attacked on the 9th of September. This event quickly came to dominate the Bush presidency and indeed the news media around the world. The president was at a school in Florida on the morning of the attack. He was told about the first plane crashing into the North Tower on the way into the school. While in the classroom, a Secret Service agent whispered into his ear about a second plane crashing into the South Tower. However, the president waited another 7 minutes before leaving the classroom. It was soon discovered that a third plane had crashed into the Pentagon. He was quickly rushed to Air Force One, from which he took command of the situation. He demanded a grounding of all commercial flights in the New York and Washington area. He requested the military shoot down planes that did not respond to his order. A fourth plane, hijacked and probably heading for the White House, was brought down by his passengers in a field in Pennsylvania. Amid the confusion, Bush didn't know for a while if his order had caused the plane to be shot down or not, so it was a very tense situation. Later that evening, he returned to Washington and went on television to assure people that America would respond with strength and courage. 3 days later, he visited the scene of destruction at Ground Zero in New York City. In an impromptu speech among firefighters, he said that the people who tore down these buildings will soon be hearing from all of us. It was an emotional response shared by most Americans, and Bush's opinion poll rating soared to 90% in the days that followed. The CIA quickly identified Osama bin Laden as the chief planner of the event. He had been totally opposed to American military presence in Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries, and organised several external hits on American targets in recent years. His present whereabouts was known to be somewhere in Afghanistan. A week later, Bush gave an ultimatum to the Taliban government of Afghanistan to hand over bin Laden and the other al-Qaeda leaders or share in their fate. He said every nation had a choice to make. Either they were with us or with the terrorists. On the 7th of October 2001, Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan. At first, the invasion appeared to be successful as American forces joined with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan and soon defeated the Taliban forces. Within a month, the Taliban government had been overthrown. By late October, the United Nations had installed a new provisional government led by Hamid Karzai. However, the invasion failed in its primary objective to capture bin Laden and the other leaders. They had escaped through the mountains of Tora Bora and into Pakistan. Also, the victory over the Taliban was more apparent than real. The Taliban central government in Kabul had been overthrown, but the Taliban and its main organisation simply withdrew from the major towns and cities, but still controlled most of the smaller villages in the countryside. In time, they would regroup, begin to win battles, and re-establish control over much of the rest of the country. Just 4 months after 9/11, in January 2002, President Bush made a State of the Union address to Congress. He outlined what later became known as the Bush Doctrine. He said the United States considered it their right to launch a preemptive attack on countries they believe threaten the security of the United States. He stated that the war on terror would start in Afghanistan but would not end there. He identified 3 countries, Iraq, Iran and North Korea, which he claimed were enemies of the United States. These states, he said, represented an axis of evil. He was strongly encouraged in this analysis by Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld. Leaders of other countries such as Germany and France were reluctant to support such an approach. They believed the president was somewhat too aggressive. Great Britain, however, through Prime Minister Tony Blair, was very supportive. The preemptive strike doctrine outlined by Bush was soon put into effect against Iraq. Just to look at some of the background here. In the 1980s, Saddam Hussein had been an ally of the United States. The US, in fact, supported Saddam in his war against Iran as it sought to maintain balance in the Middle East. However, that war ended in stalemate and left Iraq financially very weak. Afterwards, Iraq sought to boost its oil revenues by invading Kuwait. This had ended with Saddam's defeat in the First Gulf War. Following that war, Saddam refused to allow full inspections by the UN on the nuclear parasites in Iraq. This refusal led to a belief that he was building nuclear weapons. Saddam also refused to obey United Nations mandates in relation to no-fly zones over his countries, and his forces in fact frequently fired on American planes patrolling the area. This led to a strained relationship with the US, and Congress actually adopted a policy of regime change in Iraq during the second term of Clinton's presidency. After the events of 9/11, getting rid of Saddam Hussein became a much more urgent priority. Senior officials were instructed to look for connections between Saddam and the Al-Qaeda organization. No such evidence was actually ever in fact found. However, in the fearful atmosphere of the times, Bush and his team became convinced that Saddam was building nuclear bombs and chemical weapons. Their greatest fear was that Saddam would supply a terrorist organization with such weapons to attack a major US city. He had killed thousands of his own people with chemical weapons. Bush saw it as his duty to protect America from a biological attack from Iran. Throughout 2002, he talked to other world leaders and intelligence agencies and became more convinced he had a duty to remove Saddam from power. However, there was no solid evidence that Saddam was building nuclear bombs. Bush found that Britain and Australia were very supportive, but Russia, Germany and France were much less so. Russia and France had huge oil contracts and other oil interests with Iraq, so there was division in the international community. Bush aimed to make diplomacy work, but he believed that it could only work if backed up by a military threat. Throughout 2002, therefore, the United States Army and Navy began to prepare for war. Saddam had previously refused to allow full access to nuclear sites, but in the aftermath of 9/11, he became much more flexible. He claimed he had no weapons of mass destruction, but he wasn't believed. In September 2002, just 12 months after the 9/11 event, Bush addressed a meeting of the United Nations. He said the UN faced a defining moment. Either Security Council resolutions would be honoured or ignored. If ignored, the UN would become irrelevant like the League of Nations. After his speech, a CIA analysis of the situation and the threat of Iraq was made available to Congress. In October, Congress granted the President authority to invade Iraq. In November, the United Nations passed a unanimous resolution 1441 demanding that Iraq should readmit UN inspectors. The resolution also requested Saddam to prove that he did not have weapons of mass destruction. Within 2 weeks, a team of scientists led by Hans Blix were readmitted to Iraq. In February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell presented the case to the UN in which he claimed that Iraq was hiding weapons of mass destruction. Powell later deeply regretted this, as it was based on false intelligence. In late February 2003, Bush and Blair looked for a second resolution from the UN to declare war on Iraq. However, they failed to achieve this. By mid-March 2003, Bush decided to declare war without UN support and ordered the inspectors out of Iraq. In a final gesture, he gave Saddam Hussein and his sons 48 hours to leave the country or face war. They failed to comply, and a week later, on the 20th of March 2003, the invasion began. Having failed to get UN support, Bush brought together a group of countries known as the Coalition of the Willing. About a half dozen countries actually, the United Kingdom, Poland, the United States, Spain, Italy and Australia led the invasion. Apart from these, several other countries later acted in a peacekeeping role. Without the support of the UN, the invasion of Iraq was considered illegal by most countries and they refused to take part. Several other major powers such as France, Germany and Russia publicly opposed the war. The invading forces quickly overpowered the Iraqi defences. In June, Bush gave a speech on board the USS Lincoln with a background sign proclaiming "Mission accomplished." This looked very premature given what happened later. In the aftermath of the invasion, coalition forces tried to get rid of all members of the Saddam Hussein Ba'ath Party from the civil service and from the military. However, this was another blunder as it led to further chaos inside Iraq. With the collapse of the central government, a power vacuum emerged. The country became lawless and leaderless as local militias attempted to dominate certain areas and regions. In December 2003, Saddam Hussein was captured, which led to further conflict between Muslims. However, the coalition forces gradually established control of the situation. In January 2005, the first free elections were held to establish democracy in Iraq. Most Iraqis were happy to see Saddam toppled, but were opposed to the appalling manner in which it happened. Estimates of civilian deaths from the invasion and the civil war that followed vary from 200 to over 500,000 people. The execution of Saddam Hussein in 2006 created further conflict within the country. The following year, 2007, Bush announced a major increase of over 20,000 additional troops. This helped to stabilize the situation, and the Iraqi government eventually asserted control over the situation as they defeated various rebel groups. Years later, a more radical Islamic group known as ISIS emerged in Iraq and the Syrian border region. They were mainly inspired by the invasion of Iraq by Western powers. Bush and Blair later attempted to justify the war on the basis of getting rid of a brutal dictator and establishing democracy. However, this analysis basically fails or ignores the fact that dictators were often overthrown in several countries by internal revolt without anything like as much bloodshed. Both leaders were proved wrong in their initial claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. The Secretary General of the United Nations later stated that as far as the UN was concerned, the war was illegal. Also, it has to be said that the Taliban government or the organisation of the Taliban in Afghanistan were never really defeated. They simply went into hiding for 2 decades and later emerged stronger than ever during the Joe Biden administration. Hundreds of thousands of innocent people were killed or injured or left homeless, who had nothing to do with the collapse of the Twin Towers. President Bush set up the Department of Homeland Security, which managed a far more effective sharing of security information between the various federal agencies. The new department created security efficiencies never before seen in the United States. So far, it has proved very effective in preventing further attacks. Airport security was also greatly improved. Eventually, bin Laden was tracked down and shot in Pakistan in May 2011 during the Obama presidency. The so-called war on terror has since become a discredited idea. The 2 wars which Bush launched cost the United States billions of dollars and greatly increased the national debt. By the end of his presidency, the economy had come crashing down also due to the financial deregulation during the Ronald Reagan and Clinton presidencies. This in turn led to the housing bubble in Bush's second term, which eventually crashed the economy. In the early years, Bush had overhauled the tax system with substantial reductions in tax rates in both the 2001 and 2003 acts. This helped boost the economy, but it also increased the national debt. George W. Bush also made a significant contribution to the United States educational system. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2002 increased testing and literacy level throughout the states. He was also elected to a second term in November 2004, but the following year his response to Hurricane Katrina was considered too slow and inadequate. The unemployment rate also doubled from 4 or 5 to 10%. George W. Bush responded to the economic crisis of 2008 by setting up the Troubled Assets Relief Program, which is a very important step. It transferred $700 billion to the financial sector, which saved the banking system. In retirement, he wrote a book entitled Decision Points. In it, he outlined how many of his important decisions were made. He made many good decisions, but for most people, they were outweighed by the decision to invade Iraq without sufficient evidence. He is a man of strong Christian conviction, but that conviction seemed to be overwhelmed by the fear and shock that gripped America in the aftermath of 9/11.